You're listening to the weekly Parsha Podcast with Ari Goldwag, recorded with Hashem's never-ending assistance in Ramat Beit Shemesh Israel 5779 2019. This week's Parsha is Parsha Shemini. And in our Parsha, at the very end of the Parsha, we have different halachos, different laws that are related to the concept of Tumah and Tahara, impurity and purity. And I'd like to share with you a piece from Rabbi Chaim Friedlander. It's not a long piece, but it's a beautiful piece, interesting piece, and that has to do with this topic. From the concept of the laws of purity and impurity, and generally speaking in regards to the concept of the Mikvah, which is a special body of water into which one immerses if they are impure, we can learn about the greatness of the human being, and from the other side of it, from the other perspective, his lowliness. And the concept that anything that is connected to something which is pure, it itself is pure. Okay? Tumah mekabel rak Yisrael. When we speak about the concept of purity and impurity, it's only shaykh, we only discuss this concept in regards to the people of Israel, to the Jewish people. Kirak hu shaykh latahara. Only a Jew can become impure, and only a Jew can become purified. Goy shalei shaykhetz latahara. But a non-Jew, so for such a person, we can't really speak about the concept of purity. So therefore we can't speak about the concept of impurity as well. We find that there's many different types of tumah. Our parsha actually speaks mainly about tumah, for example, of touching a sheretz, a bug, a certain dead bug. Other things that cause tumah, other things that cause impurity. But the highest level of impurity is a dead body, a dead human being. And the question is, why is it that a human being's impurity is, when a person has died, why is it that it's the highest level of impurity? Every single Israelite, every single member of the Jewish people has a lofty soul, has a piece of God embedded inside of him. The soul of the Jewish person is hewn out from the bottom of the throne of God's glory, as it were. Which is the source of holiness. Yetzer Tov, which is the good inclination within the person. Excuse me. Where is the source of impurity? Where does it come from? It comes from the physical body, which contains the inclination towards evil, the Yetzer Hara, the evil inclination. And that's the aspect of the person which is physical, which is dark, which is made out of earth. That's the source of impurity. Now, Adam Harishon, he speaks about the fact that where did this start? Where did this all come from? Where did this begin? Amazing thing. The verse tells us, the verse in Genesis chapter 2 verse 25 tells us that Adam and Eve, they were not clothed, and yet, despite the fact that they were not clothed, they weren't embarrassed. What is the reason? Why indeed? What's the understanding? What's the depth of the concept that only after their sin was it necessary for them to wear clothing? Amazing thing. The physical body was so nullified in relationship to the soul of Adam and Chava before their sin, that because of that, so when they served God before the sin, so the way that things were was it was absolutely clear. What is the purpose of a human being? Why am I in this world? I'm here only to serve Hashem, in order to serve God. And therefore, everything that they did was subservient. Their physical body was completely subservient to their soul, which was completely clear both on an intellectual level and on an emotional level, that that's all there is serving God. There was no real desire or inordinate desire for anything physical, for any bodily needs. There was no necessity to cover up any parts of the body. since the body was completely batal, was completely nullified to the soul, completely subservient to the soul, so the physical body was only there never to take over and to assert its own needs. Its needs were only completely subservient to the needs of the soul, to serve God. Because of Haramban, like the Ramban says in Genesis chapter 2, verse 9. When it came to them having relations together, it wasn't like it is today, where there's like an inordinate amount of desire in regards to that taiva, in regards to that desire. Since, explains Reb Chaim Friedlander, that their entire desire was to serve God, that was their only focus. So the taiva of the body, it was just something that happened, just like someone takes a drink. Someone takes a drink, it's not, unless a person has an inordinate desire in regards to food and drink, but an ordinary person, so there's nothing special about it, it's nothing outstanding about that desire. The Ramban says that therefore, right? When we see the face uncovered or a hand uncovered, so it doesn't arouse any desire. Why? Because there's nothing intrinsically that awakens a person. There's no energy around that thing, right? And therefore, so the parts of the human being that were involved in, or that are involved in the relations between a man and a woman, between a man and his wife, so those aspects, they were no different than a hand or a face, because there was no extreme energy around them, and therefore it wasn't necessary, they weren't embarrassed, it wasn't necessary to cover them. When the level of Adam and Eve was on a level of enlightenment, everything was so clear, it was all about doing God's will, the fulfillment of God's will, that's all that there was. That's all there was that they were interested in. At this level, there was no concept of impurity, right? There was no death. There was no death, because death is associated with Adam and Eve after the sin, after they've fallen from grace, after they've fallen from the level where their entire essence, their entire desire, their entire will is only to do God's will. Only then does impurity come onto the scene. When their physical body is completely subservient to their soul, so then there's no tumah, there's no impurity. That state is one where the soul actually purifies the body. The body has nothing of its own, it's not interested in anything, there's no inordinate desire. But after the sin, there was a certain disconnect between the soul and the physical body. The person's experience of himself no longer is completely spiritual, but rather a person sees himself more as a physical being than as a spiritual being, often. Right? It became its own thing in and of itself, the physical body. So then there was something that it fell down in its relationship between there was a fall in the relationship between the physical body and the soul. Since what happened through the sin, so it strengthened the power of evil in the creation, in the physical body. The power of physical desires and enjoyments. So the way it is now, we're very aware of how it is now, where there's a physical desire for things. So an amazing thing happens, because now we have a combination of opposite forces, of two different desires within a human being. The mind of a person knows that the right thing to do is God's will, right? But on the other side, pulling him in the other direction, is the feeling that one wishes to have enjoyments of this world, to have the imaginary desires. He thinks that he's going to feel good by having those desires. That which is sweet and an enjoyment for people. That was the level that they reached as they came down from their exalted level into the level where we find ourselves. So they realized that they were naked. What is the idea? When a person has cognitive dissonance, there's a dissonance between what I know is right and what part of me wants, my physical reality desires, my yitzhar hara, my evil inclination wants. That's what causes a person to have embarrassment. As a result of the contradiction between his actions, between a person's actions, or I would extend it to say even a person's physical desires, or his actions based on those desires, the physical desires, and when it's compared, the dissonance between that and what a person knows to be right with his conscience, the will of God is what a person ultimately wants on the highest level. Therefore, they saw the need to cover up the body and to hide it. And as a result, like we said, as a result of this disconnect between the physical body and the spiritual aspect of the human being, the result was that death came upon the human being. Tuma, the result was impurity. Tumas nida, also the impurity of when a woman is menstruating. So all these things are a result, because Eve originally was always fertile, was always able to give birth. In fact, it didn't take 9 months, it was instantaneous, right? Only after the fall from grace, only after they fell from that exalted state, did they experience impurity. Now, Tuma is not, like we said, what is the concept of Tuma, of impurity? It's natkut haguf mishibud al neshama. It's a disconnect of the body from being subservient to the soul. Kol zman she'adam chai, as long as a person is alive, haneshama mechuberes laguf, lo yichal laguf tuma atzmis. As long as the soul is attached, because we need to understand this, and this is what he's going to come to explain. Why is it that impurity comes on the person when either the person dies or when someone comes in contact with the dead? What is the idea that the impurity comes when a person is dead? So he says like this, an amazing thing: as long as a person is still alive, as long as the soul is within his body, so there is no intrinsic impurity that comes on. It can come through touching, and that can be removed through the ephar para, through the ashes of the red heifer. But the physical body of a person, as long as he's alive, as long as his soul is inside of his body, so that impurity is not like the impurity that occurs when a person dies. As long as the human body is still attached to the soul within it, so then the physical body is affected by the soul. There's an opportunity for the human being or for the soul of the human being to use the body in its service of God. And even someone who's evil, who's not serving God, as long as he's still alive, there's still a possibility of a person doing tshuva. He can do the tikkun, he can fix himself through his soul. What happens when a person dies and the soul leaves the human body? The impurity comes down onto that physical body. When there's the lack of the holiness of the soul, when the soul has left, the lack of holiness allows for, there's a vacuum, a spiritual vacuum, which allows impurity to come in. And this impurity is so heavy, is so stringent, to the point where even if someone doesn't actually come into contact with a dead body, but if one comes into a tent or a house within which a dead body is located, so the person can become impure. The live person, or a person touches the dead body, even the surroundings of the dead person also can cause impurity. What is the concept of purity? Purity means returning to the state where one is meshubed, one is subservient to the will of God. To the extent that a person makes himself subservient to God, so to the extent that he does that, he understands the truth and the purpose of creation. So to the extent that a person makes himself subservient to the will of God, so then the physical body also becomes subservient. The taivas of the human being, the desires of the person, become less and less. They become minimized. We find an amazing concept. Anything that's attached to purity, anything that's physically attached to purity, becomes pure. That's the concept of the mikvah. We're going to see soon. The concept of dipping in the special waters of the mikvah. What is the idea? What is the concept? The concept is that when a person attaches himself to something tahor, pure, it means that he's attaching himself to the will of God. And in such a way, a person draws down the hashpah, the effects of holiness. And by the way, this isn't written here, but Torah is called mayim. Torah is called water. Why is it called water? Because the effect of Torah is, just like we're going to see that Hashem is called a Mikvah, God is called the one who purifies the people of Israel. The Torah is that which allows us to connect ourselves to God, is the purifying waters which teach us what is the will of God. And when we make ourselves subservient to the Torah, in essence, we are making ourselves subservient to God. Okay, now what is the unique characteristic of the water in which we dip when it comes to going in the mikvah? What is the concept of it? Taharas hatuma dafka b'mikvah oimei mayon. The concept of going into a mikvah, which is a collection of waters. What is the idea? So it can be a collection of waters. It has to be under certain, in order for it to be a collection, it has to be under certain circumstances, under certain conditions. Or it could also be like a river or a lake, a natural body of water. The common denominator of a mikvah, of any kind of mikvah, is that it has to be something which man has not affected the water. This is what the Maral says. That the mikvah purifies someone who's impure. What does a person do? He takes off all of his clothing, interestingly. This is my comment, but he becomes like Adam HaRishon Kodem HaChet. He takes off all of the embarrassment from himself. Why? Because he's coming back into a relationship with God. He comes into the water. There's no part of his body that can be separate. Every part of his body has to be touching the water. Can't be covered with clothes. Can't be covered with anything. Because the concept of the mikvah is a body of water that you can't speak about impurity. Why? Because it is the hands of man have not touched it, so to speak, on a halachic level. So when a person attaches himself to this purity, the purity of the water of the mikvah, so then he's attaching himself to the will of God and detaching himself from the impurity. According to this general principle, anything which is connected to purity is pure. So if you want to use water which was drawn, well, this is somebody takes a bucket and wants to fill up the mikvah with buckets of water, you can't do that. That's something which was affected by man. It has to be something which arrived there naturally. It has to be a natural rainwater, etc. Because the human being has had to do with it. It's specifically the water of a spring or the water of the rain which purifies a person. Why? Because a human being has not done anything to it. The water has not been affected by a human being. What happens with the human being? The human being can cause destruction within nature. When he wants to do his own will, when he wants to do the will of the human being. So waters which are drawn by a person who has impure intent can't be used for mikvah. Because a person has touched them. So there's a mixture of the human desire, the desire of the physical body, which is mixed up with, which is an anti-force, if there is such a word, which is a force against the soul. As long as a person hasn't been involved with it, with the waters, so then it's not impure. But as soon as a person is touching it, it can receive impurity. Because this is the hand of a human being that is involved with physicality and which is involved with the evil inclination. This is also true when it comes to pieces of wood that have not been fashioned into a vessel, not a bowl, not a chair, etc. That what's the halacha? They don't have the potential to become impure, right? We find that if there's a clear vessel which has been made by a person, once it's turned into a vessel, it can contract impurity. The moment that vessels are made out of them which serve the human being, which serve the human needs, the physical needs of the person, so then we're already in a state that's possible to contract impurity. This is also the concept that anything that's attached to purity is pure. One of the extensions of this idea is the concept of the mikvah, as we explained. If you have food which had become impure, which gets reattached to the ground, so it goes back to a state of purity. It's now attached to the physical land, which hasn't been affected by human hands. And then the impurity is gone. Mikvah, knisa b'kol gufay, l'mayim tivim. What is the concept of the mikvah? It's where a person goes in completely, his entire body, into natural waters. What is the concept? What is the idea? What is the kavanah that we have when we enter into a mikvah? What is the intent that we're meant to have? It's that we're completely making ourselves subservient to God's will. That's how we take away the tumah of nida, the impurity of a menstruating woman. That's how a man takes off the tumah of keri, when a person has had a seminal emission. That impurity, which comes as a result of the sin of Adam Harishon, of Adam and Eve, is taken off through the mikvah. Because in so doing, the person goes back to his state of subservience to Hashem, subservience to the soul, subservience to the spiritual. Asiyas Ratzon Hashem Yisbarach, doing God's will. Ashreichem Yisrael, praiseworthy are you, O people of Israel, ifnei mi atem metarim, umi metar eschem. Before whom are you purifying yourselves? Who purifies you? Mikvah Yisrael Hashem. The Gemara Yuma brings down that who is the mikvah of the Jewish people, the purifying waters of the Jewish people, is God. Eich mikvah Yisrael Hashem. What is the concept of this mikvah Yisrael, the mikvah of the people of Israel, is God? Through attaching ourselves completely to God's will. Like the Maral says, so to Yisrael, so to God purifies the people of Israel. Through our attachment to God completely, without any separation at all. Of course, God is completely disconnected from any sins. And therefore, to you, the people of Israel, you have that purification through God by attaching ourselves to God. When we attach ourselves to the Torah, which is God's will, when we attach ourselves to try to understand what is it that God wants from us, when we go through the waters of the mikvah, all these things serve to remind us that what is our purpose here on this earth? Our purpose is to serve God. I want to bless you and ask you to bless me back. Hashem should help us to incorporate this idea, understand this idea of Tumah and Tara. Try to purify ourselves, purify our intentions. Try with all of our might to serve God properly. Thank you so much for listening. Have a wonderful Shabbos. This podcast was made possible through the gracious donations of listeners like you. For more podcasts like this, please visit www.arigoldwag.com or search on iTunes Ari Goldwag.